So, good morning, everyone. We're just going to let people join now as we're getting started. Myself and Conor got into the chats about the economic outlook there. So, I think we're in for a very, very interesting session and questions afterwards, as always. So, just as people are joining us, um, and clicking in. Just to say good morning, I'm Ber Grogan, the Executive Director of Simon Communities of Ireland. Officially 1 year today, Conor. It's my anniversary. It's
Congratulations.
my Simon anniversary, and for Julia as well, our policy analyst. It was the 27th of January last year that we both started. So yeah, so it's a great way to be spending the first year. And you were the first Simon Talks last year as well that I had participated in. So it's great. I know you're always kicking off the year for us, where we can look at the economic outlook. As usual, if you're new to Simon Talk, so we don't have the chat function open, but what we do have is I'll be handing over to Connor and he'll go through some slides and his presentation, and then we'll come out of that. And if you have any specific questions, you can put them in through the Q&A box along the bottom. So if you could I'll keep an eye on questions as they're coming in, but if people want to kind of sit and maybe make a note of your questions as we're going through, or just put them in the Q&A box as Connor is chatting, and we'll come to them then afterwards. So I know we've loads to get through in the hour, so I'm going to disappear off and be quiet and leave you with Connor, who's our associate research professor with the ESRI. I'm sure many of you are coming back. This is like Connor's fans that come for the first Simon Talks of the year each year with us. So yeah, really looking forward to the presentation and the chat that we're going to have afterwards. So I'll be in the background here, Connor, if you need anything. But otherwise I'll see you at the end of your slides.
Okay, great. Thanks very much, Bear, and thanks to everybody for logging on this morning. It's a great pleasure for me to be back here again, giving the Simon Talks and trying to think through what may be facing us in the short-term outlook. Obviously, with the weather as dismal as it is out there, I'll try and focus on some of the positives as well as the kind of risks to the outlook, and both from a kind of macro perspective, but also from a housing perspective. And then I'm happy to take any questions and comments people would have on various aspects of the talk. So let me talk. I thought, you know, a good place to start, rather than kind of focus in on some of the short-term negativity and some of the short-term challenges that we face. There's been huge geopolitical changes in the past number of weeks that really are presenting great threats to the Irish economic model. But rather than kind of focus in on those, I wanted to just look back and try and uh, contextualize what has happened in the Irish economy, in particular over the last 10 years, and really just highlight how strong a performance we've experienced, and what that means in terms of both employment, population, and also the housing requirements, because that's a kind of a big thing for all of us in the housing space, trying to think through how do we activate a greater production of housing. So let me start with this chart. Okay, so this looks at employment growth. This is the best lens into what's happening in the Irish economy. Doesn't get affected by all of these indicators and these multinational distortions. This is just employment growth, okay? And it's presented here with a bunch of other economies, selected in particular to try and look at small open economies who would have kind of similar trading structures to Ireland. And what you can see here, which is the green line, this is employment growth in Ireland, and it has been much higher since the financial crisis than in all of these other economies, some of which are very well performing, as well as Ireland. And okay, we have the blip around the COVID period there, but even predating that and after that, Ireland has had a very sustained employment boom over the past number of years, and that is a major strength and robustness of the Irish labour market. And when we think about some of the near-term challenges, I think it's really important that we do recognize that employment growth has been very strong and has been kind of coming from multiple sources over time. So with employment growth, obviously, that is able to happen, because we've had a very rapid expansion in the population. And I think for Ireland, a country that for many years, for nearly for well over a century, has had a major demographic deficit and experienced huge levels of emigration. I think it's really important to contextualize the very positive increase in employment and how that has been linked to our population growth over time. This again picks similar countries, benchmarks them all in 1990, and looks at our population growth over time. You can see it has, earlier in the 60s and 70s, Ireland's population growth and level was way lower relative to these other countries, but we've had that massive expansion in population, and this has fed through into employment and economic growth and all of the positive benefits that have come through that expanded population. So I think these are important contexts to place when we think about some of the short-term challenges and the short-term outlook. Ireland's economy really has changed in the past 30 years, and it's we have a robust labour market. That's in the background of all of that. Obviously, when you think about the increase in population and the positive economic growth, one feature that comes through is this really low unemployment rate, and this is really important when we're thinking about the housing requirements. In particular, when you look at Ireland compared to some of these other countries, you look here at Sweden, Finland, the Netherlands. Ireland's unemployment rate is really low compared to some of these other economies, and you can see the volatility. Obviously, Ireland had that crisis period, which the unemployment rate was much higher, and you can see that improvement in the period since. And this is something that has provided that strong economic context and robust performance. The difficulty with the low unemployment rate is that when we're trying to deal with the very many binding infrastructure constraints that we have, and I'll talk a little bit more about this in more detail later on, we're talking about the housing requirements we need, also the climate-related investments we need, but then also just the general infrastructure deficits around health and education and transport. All of these are very difficult to deal with in an economy with a low unemployment rate and those capacity constraints binding. So I think this is whilst a source of strength, it's also something we need to recognize when we're trying to think about how do we plan our investment over time to get the best return and to deal with the infrastructure bottlenecks that we all know are present in the Irish economy. So then if we move to kind of the housing space, and I always like to think about this in not only the short term, but also the long term. Okay. And we know we've had that major expansion in population, a huge employment boom that's gone with that, and that all the positive economic benefits that come with that. But one of the things that's very clear is we've been underproducing housing, and we've been underproducing it for quite some time now. So what this chart does is it looks at housing output in terms of the number of units in a kind of very long-term perspective. So on the left-hand chart here, you have the number of units produced. You can see that huge boom over the Celtic Tiger period and into the credit boom period, and then that massive drop-off in the financial crisis. We have had that recovery in the period since 2016 onwards, but the question is, how big is that, and how impactful is that relative to what we need as an economy and as a population? And that's where this red line comes in. So what this does is it looks at housing output per 1,000 persons, okay? And its scale is here on the right-hand chart. And what you can see there is that if you look at the more recent points, we're producing less housing per 1,000 persons than we were in the 1970s. And that really just shows you the housing deficit, that infrastructure deficit that we have in the housing sector, and how much we need to expand this to be able to provide the housing that's needed for the Irish economy and the Irish and Irish society. So really, I think this is a very good lens into these general long-term challenges around the provision of infrastructure. So what needs to happen there? Well, obviously one of the elements that needs to that we need to have is an increase in expenditure. And when you think about the housing sector and where the challenges are uh, across the population in terms of housing affordability, in terms of housing access, it's much more concentrated in that bottom half of the income distribution towards lower income households. And so the requirement will be for sustained state investment in housing over time to be able to cater for those affordability challenges. And you can see here, this looks at government spending. I know in the ESRI been warning about excess expenditure and in the economy, in terms of government spending growth. But again, the real concern there is that there's far too much spending happening at at a point in the cycle when the economy has a low unemployment rate and binding capacity constraints, and we need to make sure we target that expenditure, particularly towards capital and particularly towards the areas where we get the best bang for our buck. Okay, so I thought they were important points just to make in terms of the kind of longer term perspective, looking back a little bit, um, uh, a bit further than we would when we're thinking about our short term outlook and the short term challenges that we face. Um, and then that kind of allows us to think about the short term challenges a little bit differently, and maybe tries to think about how do we make policy choices now that can help protect us from some of the potential downside risks that we see um, on the horizon. So the best link with that is the kind of labor market piece. So obviously we produce our quarterly economic commentary 4 times a year. The figures I have here have come from our winter commentary, um, and I think you're always wondering when you move from commentary to commentary whether there'll be major changes happening. But what has happened since January with the changes in the US EU relationships, with the changed US um, international uh, kind of geopolitical engagement with other countries and with other partners. I think there has been just a major increase in some of the downside risks that we potentially face, and how the US is using, for example, trade policy to try and achieve um, diplomatic ends. And this is a, a position we have never been before in certainly in living economic memory. And really, this puts huge amount of emphasis on what is the sustainability of Ireland's US multinational led economic growth model, which has been hugely successful over the past number of decades. You can see in the figures here, for our short-term outlook for the economy, obviously the gross domestic product, the GDP figure, that swings wildly in Ireland based on these multinational exports. We saw a major surge in exports in 2025, which um, isn't going to be repeated this year. This was the kind of anticipation of the tariff being brought in and what may happen uh, for Trump's decisions around what the EU-US tariff would be. In particular, we saw a huge increase in pharma exports in the first quarter of last year. Because we don't anticipate these to occur again, we are expecting GDP to decline in 2026. But again, behind these GDP figures, there's kind of idiosyncratic, sector-specific uh, effects that are very, very difficult to predict. But again, what's building into our thinking here is that we had that major expansion in exports in 2025, and we don't expect those levels to be held up this year. So we do expect that to come down. In terms of modified domestic demand, it's kind of a much better lens into the Irish economy. I'm not sure if everybody is familiar with this. What this basically does is try and focus in on indicators that are less affected by those multinationals. So it looks at household spending, it looks at government spending, it looks at tries to get at domestic investment. So what you can see there, it is much more stable. It rose, quite sharply in 2025, but again, there were some one-off factors in that, and we are expecting it to come down in 2026. So behind the kind of headline points there is we are expecting the economy to slow moderately at this point from 25 into 26. I think it's kind of useful to maybe point out some of these effects on the international trade side, because they really do affect our numbers, and they really do affect our outlook. You can see the chart here looks at goods exports and service exports. Each are about half of Ireland's total exports overall. What you can see very clearly in the light blue dashed line was that major increase in goods exports through 24 and certainly into early 25, and then that drop off afterwards. And actually, in some of the more recent data we've had since the commentary was produced, you can see that drop off continuing into the fourth quarter of 2025. So this was the in particular the U.S. pharmaceutical companies moving inventories over to the U.S., moving production over to the U.S. to try and uh, get ahead of the introduction of tariffs. We don't expect that to continue. I think one of the other points that we tried to make um, across the last two commentaries in particular was Ireland's role in the EU engagement to international trade deals. Obviously, as you've as I've kind of documented with the employment boom in Ireland, you know, international engagement and kind of globalization has had a very positive effect on Ireland's economy. And but we do see this concentration risk on the activities with the US. So one potential way, because we're a small domestic market, one potential way for us to try and mitigate that down over time is to engage to a greater extent with international trade deals outside our existing trade partners to try and diversify our export market. So, in particular, to try and leverage benefits from the new EU trade deals, be it Mercosur or others, when they do happen, and make sure that Ireland can diversify its trading activity, because we are a small economy domestically, so we want growth in living standards. It's going to have to come through in international engagement. Okay, yeah, this just kind of gives us a little bit more detail on what's happening with the two big export sectors. I think this is kind of really, really important, because not only has pharmaceuticals been a major driver of exports recently, but computer services are a huge are the kind of largest export uh, sector that we have, and they're all dominated by the US multinationals as well as the pharmaceuticals. So really, we have this very, very concentrated export base, which is linked to the multinationals. And you can see the bottom line here, which is the pharmaceutical exports. This really, relative to what happened in the first quarter of 2025, you can see our assumption there is that that will just level off, and therefore we won't have a repeat in that big increase that we saw in the first quarter of last year. Okay, so let me just quickly talk through the domestic piece, and then I'll move on to the housing sector specifically. Again, we've seen this strong economic growth. We see that specifically through the consumption channel. Household spending has been strong. It has held up, uh, very strongly in international context, and that has come through the kind of rising nominal incomes that we've seen in recent years, the continued high savings, and the increase in employment that we've seen over time. So that kind of robust domestic market, labor market, that all has provided a supportive context for household spending. Obviously, one of the challenges that we have seen more recently is the rapid growth in government spending. We feel that's too strong for this point in the cycle. We do and note that infrastructure bottlenecks need to be dealt with, but that, in our view, means that restraint needs to be held in other areas of expenditure, in net expenditure in particular. So, revenue raising measures should be used to offset increases in expenditure. so that the kind of fiscal stance isn't so expansionary over time. Okay, let me just talk very briefly about our labour market forecasts before I move on to the housing side. Obviously, I've highlighted a number of times the strength in the labour market, but we are seeing some signs of a softening in the labour market. So in the period coming up to the last number of quarters, when we put the commentary together, what you could see was some of those kind of more near-term indicators dropping down somewhat in terms of the labour market. And, we are expecting the unemployment rate to be moderately higher relative to this year, just a kind of a moderate tip up in the unemployment rate as the labour market softens. And this really is coming through some of these international sectors, that international uncertainty. We are expecting investment to slow. We are expecting um, hiring to slow, in particular for, say, ICT firms, um, as the kind of economy moves, tries to find a way through this heightened uncertainty that's come through the US policy. Okay, so let me talk briefly about the housing sector before I hand back to to Burr for any questions and thoughts. I always like looking at this particular chart when we start thinking about housing in Ireland. This is the major change that we've experienced over time in the tenure structure. So you can see, chart looks at the proportion of households in different tenures. The grey bar here is owner occupation. Then you've got that light blue bar, which is the local authority rentals, and then the blue bar here, which is the private and AHB rentals. So that's the private rental sector, and anything that it would include the kind of AHB stock of housing. It is very clear that we have had a major change in the tenure structure in Ireland. So you think about our historic our kind of historic structures here was very high uh, home ownership, very high number of mortgages per head of population, and very few people in the rental sector. And the rental sector being a kind of a tenure that had a very high turnover, was used as a kind of transitionary sector, but really didn't have a long-term kind of provision of housing piece as we would have seen the rental sector in other economies, in particular the European economies. And that to me is a major change that we're facing in Ireland. You can see the proportion of rental housing has increased, has kind of over doubled since 1991. And when you think of that population growth, that employment growth, a huge number of that increase in population has moved into that rental sector. And we know the major challenges that we face in the rental sector in terms of the price of rents increasing, the access to rental housing, and just having that general undersupply of affordable rental in the overall market. Okay, so I talked a little bit about the overall, the kind of low provision of housing in Ireland, and I want to just mention a couple of points on the kind of long-term structural demand for housing. So obviously, this is kind of a point we've all probably heard ad nauseum now, that there's been a huge number of papers and that have looked at trying to estimate how many new housing units we need in Ireland over time. And I think if you look across them all, if you think about what they account for and don't account for, there's two things you need to include. You need to include that kind of structural demographic demands that will be through population growth and through changing household size. That was what my colleagues Adele Bergen and Paul Egan did in their piece. But also, because we've been under providing housing relative to the population need over time, we do need to think about this pent up demand that was obviously included in the Housing Commission and in the central bank work. So in general, when we think about the number of new housing units that Ireland needs, it's way north of 50,000 per annum we need to get every single year to be even getting close to breaking even. So if you think about the current production of housing in and around the mid 30s, we're kind of way lower than we need to be. And you can see that in that previous long-term trend that I had, which shows that the number of housing units produced per capita is lower now than it was in the 1970s. Okay, so let me then talk a little bit about these capacity constraints, and this, what I'm going to start talking about a little bit more over time, is this triple challenge that the construction sector is starting to face. So, what is this triple challenge? So we know we need to nearly double our housing output, but we also have this huge requirement to improve our broader infrastructure, and I'm talking about uh, our decarbonisation plans, our general investment in public transport. I'm talking about the energy efficiency transformation of our residential housing stock, of our commercial housing stock, and also just the kind of general investments that we need in commercial and industrial housing, and all our commercial and industrial activity. And all of that has to be done with the same labor, the same materials, and the same physical and financial capital in the construction sector. And you can see this chart here on the right hand side looks at the investment in level terms from the national accounts across a couple of indicators. We have one which is residential improvements, we have the green line which is dwellings, and then we have other building and construction. We really can see the challenge of how do we double this housing output, this dwellings one, when we're trying to do all of this other activity, and the economy is at pretty much full employment. So really, to me, this triple challenge that we have leads me to say we have to make choices across and between, rather than trying to do everything all at the same time, because it's not going to be economically feasible. So I think, two interesting lenses into what happens if we try to do too much too quickly is that we will just get inflation and resource inflation, both uh, in the labor market and other resources for the construction sector. You can see here on the left hand side, um, more recently we've had an increase in construction employment. We're just in and around 190,000 employees at present. But you can see, because we've been investing, the increase in investment has been so stark in the construction sector. If you look at the right hand chart here, which looks at wages, we can see the wages are rising in the construction sector, and this is a clear piece of evidence for capacity constraints. So how do we deal with all this? How do we try and get more output from the same amount of resources? And how do we think about choosing between, what is going to give us the best bang for our buck and meet our objectives in the short term? Well, one of the things that we really need to think about is productivity in the construction sector. You can see the left-hand chart here. You see this green line here, which is Ireland. This is output per worker in construction, and we can see Ireland is low compared to other European countries, in particular some of the other uh, the small open economies that we would kind of typically benchmark Ireland against. So our construction sector is low productivity relative to some of these other countries. Also, what we can see on the right hand side is that Ireland has been investing an awful lot less by the firms that are in that sector than historically it had been. So this blue line here is the capital stock in the construction sector, and you can see that was depleted massively following the financial crisis, and we can see that hasn't been replaced to the same extent afterwards. So we have a low productivity sector that has had low investment over time, and these are really challenges when we're trying to increase output in a labor constrained market. Okay, so they're the kind of structural pieces, and what does that mean for the very short term in terms of the housing outlook? And I think there's a couple of points to maybe make in this context. First, we are expecting in and around 35,000 housing units last year and this year. Okay, um, why do we think that? Well, there was that big, huge increase in commencements that happened in 20 in from 24 into 25, and we expect that with the to come through into the market in through the end of last year and into this year. Beyond that forecast horizon, the outlook looks really mixed. We had a big drop in commencements last year. Okay, and we had and the planning permissions really have picked up somewhat, but are lower than we would need to be getting north of 50,000 over time. So really, we feel the outlook looks like it's continuing to be in and around the mid 30s for the near term horizon. Okay, so let's think about that from a policy response perspective. You can see this chart here talked about that kind of over long-term moving average in terms of planning permissions. Well, you can see here the chart. It's very clear that apartments has been one of the areas where the planning permissions have dropped off a cliff from 21, 22 down to the present period. So obviously there have been measures to try and aim at addressing what they call this viability gap um, in terms of the planning permissions. Um, there's pros and cons of a lot of these measures. To me, the emphasis really has to be on uh, trying to get more investment into that of kind of affordable piece that will provide housing for the bottom half of the income distribution. So what does that mean? That means a huge expansion of the cost rental program in particular, huge expansion in terms of the of the overall social housing provision, and then trying to cater for affordable purchase as well. That targeting to me of the bottom half of the income distribution in terms of housing production really will be where we get our biggest bang for our buck overall. What needs to happen there? Well, we need to focus on these structural changes. We need to focus on the structural changes, as I mentioned earlier, in the construction sector, and also trying to address some of the supporting infrastructure deficits in the water and wastewater, for example, that we know are very clear. Okay, I mentioned I wanted to mention this European housing affordable housing plan, just really because it is a kind of a big change in the broader context. Obviously, Ireland um, has been dealing with the housing crisis here for many years. But now, because of developments, in particular more recently maybe than Ireland, in other European countries, housing has become central to the European agenda as well. And that's really welcome, right? It provides a huge amount of access to resources and knowledge for Ireland. You can see the kind of plan that they would have in terms of their kind of the key components of it are very much the type of things that we're focusing on here in Ireland. And in a sense, my hope with the European housing affordable housing plan was we can get as many opportunities from that in terms of access to finance, regulations, helping to learn from some of the productivity in the other countries, etc. And without having some of the downside complexities that may come with it. Okay, so let me conclude then, and then I'm happy to take any questions and comments on the longer term or the short term stuff. 4 key structural areas I think we need to centralize our focus on. One is structural change in the construction sector. That has to come through boosting productivity, increasing firm sizes. It needs to ensuring we have sufficient scale in the sector, and also making sure that we can reform the planning and judicial systems to make sure that they are not a barrier to development. I think if you look at the infrastructure task force report that came out just prior to Christmas, we really just need to follow that in my view, and get a lot of those changes and policy changes through. We need to get much more active and continue to be more active in terms of land activation and land management. We need to use land as a factor of production rather than having it as a kind of an accumulating asset, and make sure that is not becoming a barrier to the production of housing. From a policy perspective from the state, what can it do? Well, it can target the supporting and enabling infrastructure around housing, as it has done with that new fund that announced, but it needs to make sure it continues to focus on that, and that really means electricity, water, and the networks that go around it. And again, from a policy perspective, where do I feel that the government will need to, when we look at how the costs of producing housing have gone over time and how they have departed away from incomes, where is the government going to have to focus its efforts in the medium term is going to have to be on the production of low income housing through both social housing and, to me, a major expansion over time in cost rental. Okay, so with that, I will conclude the presentation piece and hand back to Bear, and happy to take any questions and comments anyone has.
Thanks so much, Conor. It's fascinating as always. So we have a couple of questions in.
Sure.
So I was clicking on them that we'd answer live as we're going. So I'm going to go to one which you may or may not be able to answer, but it's come in from Felix O'Regan. What factors explain why output per construction worker here is so low compared to other countries? That surprised me as well about the productivity piece. Do we have any additional information on that?
Yeah, we're actually doing a project on that at the moment, and hope to have more insights into it. I think there's a number of elements to it, and the one I kind of tried to juxtapose with it was the low levels of investment in physical capital that for construction firms. I think that's one of the elements that really feeds into that. You can see uh, um, when you look at that chart of, investment kind of, and that capital stock in the construction sector depleted massively after the financial crisis. And really, there wasn't a reinvestment in that. So this is all the equipment that firms have that helps them boost productivity. So really, I think we need to provide the environmental conditions for firms to be able to invest in the physical capacity of their hand, and that should help them boost the capital labor ratio and allow them to expand productivity over time. I think that's important. I think scale matters. I think we've an awful lot of smaller construction firms in Ireland. You can get efficiencies and economies of scale with larger firms. So I think over time, expanding the number of large producers that we have in Ireland would provide us with economies of scale. So I think there are two things that are kind of help to explain that gap. Probably don't explain it all, but give kind of a signposting for where we need to target activities.
Yeah, we went over to with the Irish Homeless Policy Group. Some of us went over to the EU just before Christmas, and Gareth from Threshold had actually made that point about kind of with the EU Affordable Housing Plan and the economies of scale of. I think there's certain agreements about buying investing in defence, and his point was why not invest in construction materials if this is a thing that is an issue across Europe, and we know that affordability and the cost of construction materials is so. That was something that he kind of posed, and I've been mentioning it and mentioning Garrett's point a couple of times in different meetings now. So it's not something that I've heard an answer on yet, but I think especially when we're talking about economies of scale and that this isn't just in Ireland, that it's something maybe we need to talk about. This one is so I don't have the name of the person. Um, and it's making me think of, our rainy day funds and all of that kind of stuff. But they're saying
Yeah.
my understanding of taxes recouped from most multinational companies and exportable goods is that because they're not guaranteed, the monies accumulated from them are not often put towards government spending, especially housing. I'm presuming I'm wrong considering the topic, but any light you can shed on this would be appreciated. Um, and I suppose this is where the conversation we were having before we went live about the uncertainty and the tariffs, and we have seen investment in housing,
Mm,
we have seen investment in
yeah.
expenditure, but is that something over the years that you think is that a reason why, because of the uncertainty, we're not guaranteed kind of that those corporation taxes and stuff.
Yeah, well, like, let me try and uh, contextualize the risk that I see in particular from the corporation tax receipts. So, corporation taxes account for about 30% of all taxes at present, and half of that, so 15% of all taxes, come from these windfall gains in the corporation tax. So these are, by definition, potentially flighty taxes. Okay,
Mm,
and when you just really focus in on where they come from a very small number of firms in a very small number of US dominated sectors. And then you just think of the huge risks and changes that are happening in and around uh, the US role in international activities, and Ireland's position, as kind of economically dependent on these US firms in terms of our our overall economic activities. So it really just says to me, and we've documented this on numerous occasions in our commentary, that there's just massive risk around these funds. So what
Mm.
should you do with these? You should store them over time. It's fine to allow a part of them be used in physical investment capital that would produce, that would deal with um, that kind of infrastructure deficit in the housing space, and the broader infrastructure deficit that we know we have. But again, we really need to be thinking about storing a lot more of that wealth over time, because not only the infrastructure deficits, we have major changes coming down the line from an aging population, from all, big kind of demographic changes that are going to happen over time. And we really need to be able to deal with these.
Yeah, and I actually thought that your slide about the changes in the tenure of particularly home ownership, and that's something that we launched just last week with Galway Simon and the president on older people aging into homelessness, and the private rental sector is a huge driver of that. So that's we've put forward some six policy recommendations that's available on simon.ie on our website, but it is something that we've been talking about a lot more. We'll have the My Future Fund and enrollment, but if people don't have affordable, accessible housing as they retire, then that's
Mm.
that's going to be a huge issue. Um, so the next question here, so it's about the housing need and demand assessment. So that's the estimation of housing demand is driven by that assessment that's submitted by local authorities. And the local authorities are calculating overcrowding by 5 adults occupying a three-bed home. Um, is not overcrowded, as the only room not counted as habitable is the bathroom. So it doesn't count for adults in voluntary sharing, nor the trend towards single person households. So would a change to the housing need and demand assessment, so the information collected by local authorities, could that be a solution to calculating the real need for housing? And just before you come into that, I suppose it's something that at Simon Communities of Ireland, we've talked about hidden homelessness, and we've talked about the need for accurate, transparent data, because unless we're looking at what the real need is, then we're not going to be able to address that. And I think to your point of, we need an excess of 50,000 housing units each year, that we're not going to be coming near that with the 35,000. So, one of the tools of looking at the demand is this assessment coming from local authorities. So, is that a tool that we should be looking at updating?
Yeah, I don't know much about the HNDA myself. I was never involved in its calibration or usage, or I haven't done any research into it in detail myself. In general, look, I think it's very clear that overall we have this massive housing deficit, but
Mm,
within that context, we have a major shortage of small housing units. Okay, so uh, you know, with a shrinking household size over time, with an aging population, we're going to need more and more accessible small housing units.
mm,
And uh, you know, if you look at the housing stock in Ireland, we don't necessarily have a shortage of three-bed family homes, right? We have a shortage of these dense small units. So I think expanding the production of those and finding ways to expand the production of those over time, I think is going to have to be uh, uh, a major policy priority. One thing I want to come back to you on the issue of the kind of the aging affordable rental in kind of aging. We did a piece with the Pensions Council a couple of years ago, which looked at the at risk of poverty rate for persons
mm,
who were in the rental sector and they were transitioning into retirement. And it's a massive problem. It's a problem we never had before, because the income cliff at retirement was absorbed by the mortgage cliff that would you'd pay off your mortgage and the housing cost
yeah,
would disappear. You know, there's a much larger proportion of our population that will be in the rental sector over time. So they will need more policy supports. That's
yeah,
undoubted. And they will need to be supported more. To me, in a sense, you know, when you look at a lot of these potential households, these older households, you know, we don't really want them in the private rental sector over time. We want to transition them into longer term cost rental with a supporting subsidy so that they have an affordable um, uh, and secure housing tenure over time. So really, to me, when you look at uh, where costs have gone, the construction sector, how costs and prices have really moved away from incomes. That kind of bottom half of the income distribution is really going to struggle to afford housing at market prices, be it rental or purchase. So the state is going to have to play a bigger and bigger lifetime role in people's housing to try and make that affordable for them over time. And to me, it's going to be big increase in social housing and cost rental.
And actually on that and like that, I understand, you can't know all of the bits and pieces with the housing and homeless policies and legislative changes. But
Mm.
Rebecca Hamilton has asked there, well, first she said thanks for the great overview. We've loads of questions in. So just wondering, the proposed rental reforms, do you see them having a significant impact on the overall system in coming years? I think the minister was bringing something to cabinet today. I know they're kind of working off a 1st of March deadline. But is that something that you think will have an impact?
Yeah, look. Let me talk in general about rent controls. We've done a good bit of research on this over time, and we've talked about these at a number of different Oireachtas committees. Um, Rent controls are a very blunt tool. And when you look, there's hundreds of studies that look at these internationally. And what you can see is a very clear picture. They're good for existing tenants. They lower either the level of rents or the inflation rate, but they create major access challenges for people trying to enter the sector because there's just supply dries up. And they also have these negative effects on investment and on supply and all of these things. We've documented in a study for Ireland, and it's happening in other countries. So rent controls to me are, kind of masking the broader challenge that we have, like that I mentioned earlier, in that we have the wrong group of households have had to move to the private rental sector when they should have been in supported housing through uh, social housing or cost rental. You think of the HAP recipients. These are tenants that should be in long-term social housing rather than in the private rental sector. So
Mm.
in terms of the rent controls, um, there's an awful lot of elements to them. Um, they are still, with the 2% cap, going to be strict in an international context. Um, there is this vacancy decontrol piece that now when a tenant leaves, you can reset to market rents. That would move the Irish rules much more towards some of the more progressive international rules internationally. So I know some commentators have mentioned that may lower some of these supply side risks, but again, they are complicated. They're multi-layered. They're multifaceted, and really the impact of them is going to be depend on the calibration.
Yeah, and I know we spoke together at the Residential Tenancies Board annual conference at the end of last year. And, I am going to just pipe in with my blaming of capitalism and the financialization of housing, because we know that the rents are just so unaffordable across the board that that's going to continue to be a driver of homelessness. What we do welcome in Simon Communities of Ireland about the reforms is that the security of tenure piece, the kind of
Mhm.
the 6 year tenancies. But yeah, with the unaffordable. It's just that's not going to that's the big thing for, and again, I know we see that across Europe. So I have to get my little piece in about capitalism. Um, but I see we have a piece here about the not-for-profit or limited profit developers, similar to the Austrian system. So should they be supported in Ireland to address some of the costs and affordability issues in delivering homes?
Look, I think I haven't looked in detail into the what specific providers are good at what and how they work. So I really wouldn't like to comment on any one model that I don't have information on. I think in general, like, how do we have a construction sector that helps us produce more housing units and at lower cost? Well, that deals with the issues I mentioned before. That's economies of scale, that's investment, that's higher productivity, that's more modern methods construction. If other companies want to enter the Irish market and do that, and this type of model could help do that, that would be a positive for Ireland. So uh, I don't know the model that's being mentioned there, but if it addresses these challenges, then I would certainly be all for it.
There's loads of questions, so I'm going to rush through these to because I'm so grateful that you've given us an hour of your time again this morning. Um, Someone here is just asking about the output of construction and skills and training, and maybe kind of the demand for workers.
Mm.
Could that be kind of negating some of the training? But that might be required. But again, I don't know if that's within your scope to answer.
Yeah, I guess is not necessarily within my scope. I think obviously if you improve, you know, if training in general, if you look at the economics literature, training can improve productivity, right? Because people's skills are better, and they make better use of the resources that are available to them when they know better techniques, and they don't know how to combine the factors of production better. So certainly, if education and training can help boost productivity, I think that should be a core component of it, as well as just expanding the number of construction workers in the capital, and the modern methods, etc.
And actually, this links in quite nicely, and it was something I was thinking about as you were chatting. So you said about the choices around expenditure given the capacity constraints. So
Mm.
what choices should be prioritized given the pressing need?
Yeah, that this is a key one, right? And to me, like when we think about fixed set of construction resources, what are we trying to do? We're trying to build houses, we're trying to retrofit a lot of houses, we're trying to um, build infrastructure, we're trying to decarbonize the economy. To me, what I think we start need to start thinking is about what combination of activities can best allow us achieve those aims in the short run. So to me, the from both a social and economic perspective, the production of new housing has to be of the highest priority, in my view, because the impacts in society are just too big if we don't deal with that. So therefore, you have to cascade then down. We really have to decarbonize the Irish economy, but what investments within that do not compete with the production of housing? For example, can we decarbonize electricity grid first? So use high import content investments, for example, the windmills, etc., that really allow us to meet our climate targets and also maintain our housing production. And I think we need to start thinking more strategically across our investment choices so that we do the least competing needs first, but that allow us to meet all the objectives that we want to meet, because we
Mm,
we have to do it all.
yeah. The slide about the tenure as well mentioned around the AHBs, the approved housing bodies. So Kevin is saying here about do you see that expanding more? That AHBs will continue to scale bigger and taking on more properties and ownership. And do you expect to see mergers? So I know that was in the new housing plan by government. Again, that might be outside of your scope, but when you're looking at the tenure side and the production of housing, how do you see the AHBs linking into that?
Yeah, look, I think it's very clear they've been major providers of you know affordable rental, and I mean affordable by both social and cost rental. um I think rather than be pro any one specific type of provider, what I would say is that the Irish system needs a huge amount more cost rental and a huge amount more social housing. Um, it's highly likely the AHBs will play a big role in that, but the local authorities also have to play a major role in that, and
Mm,
and the roles will be different. Depending on the regions, it'll be different in major urban centres. It'll be different in some of the more rural or smaller towns, where maybe economies of scale, economics are different, right? So, but the housing need is still there. So maybe some of the local authorities will have to play a bigger role in some of the other areas, that there is still a housing need. So, rather than specifically talk about a type of provider, be it HBs or non-HBs, the system needs to expand, and that will need all actors pulling in the same direction.
mm, mm. I don't know if you'll have the answer to this, but Mark Hennessy has asked if you agree with the assertion by the housing agency that prices should fall within 4 years. Now, I don't know if Mark is talking about housing prices or construction prices. I assume it's just kind of overall. So within 4 years, based off your projections.
That is not something that I would be able to call. I think house prices, there's so many factors that go into that. That's not something I could comment on. I don't feel like I would be able to forecast that to that extent. Housing, the housing market, the one point I would make about house prices and research that my colleagues had published at the end of 2024 had shown that they were overvalued relative to fundamentals in Ireland. Um, you know, there are fewer and fewer people purchasing housing in Ireland relative to the population than we had in the past. And they are
Mm,
much higher income households than they were in the past. So, what's likely to happen to house prices is likely to be driven by slightly different factors than we had when purchase of housing was a much more dominant share. Think of the
mm.
tenure structure than it was in the past. But certainly, I wouldn't be able to comment on that, sir.
Yeah, I did like how you started your presentation on the kind of positive outlook, though, of, over the previous years and employment. Anne Marie O'Connor is asking just a little bit about cost rental. So Nesk and others have argued for larger non-market rental sector based on cost and available to a large proportion of the population. Do you think this is something we should be moving towards? And if large enough, would it provide an alternative to the private rental sector? So I know you've mentioned affordable and cost rental a couple of times. So you see that as one of the levers.
Yeah, I really do. I'm a big, I'm a huge fan of the concept of cost rental. I really think it's going to have to be a much bigger uh, uh, component of the Irish housing market over time. It's tricky because cost rental means costs, and costs are really high, right? So even if you do
Mm,
cost rental, it doesn't mean the rents are going to massively come down in level terms at present. People may still need subsidies, etc., to be able to afford rents. But the idea of producing much more housing at cost and that the inflation rate for those households, so how their rent increases over time, would only be linked to the cost element. So it would
mm,
be linked to how the maintenance and upkeep of those buildings and um, ensuring they stay at a quality standard, etc. Over time, that they would be the drivers of the rental inflation rather than market dynamics. I think
mm.
that's a place we really need to get to a greater extent in Ireland. So I certainly, from the research that I've done, I view cost rental as a major component of our priorities going forward.
Option. Yeah, yeah. Brilliant. Listen, that's exactly time. I've loads of other questions that I could ask you. One particularly around what were they doing so well in the 1970s that we had that difference, but maybe that's a conversation for another day. I honestly thank you so much, Connor. It's always a really eye-opening piece, and this isn't my forte at all, but I always learn so much from you, and it's so important for all of us in the conversations that we're having. And thank you to everyone for joining us this morning, all of those questions. And a huge thank you to Ailish in the background as well for helping organise all of this. So I hope everyone stays safe and dry and warm while Storm Chandra blows gales around us. But yeah, I hope everyone is minding themselves, and we'll see you all soon. Thank you so much.
Thanks, guys.